Hi students, let's pick up where we left off, and this time we're going to talk about causality in experimental design. So first side note I have to give you is that descriptive research really cannot produce any causal conclusions. It's a commonly made mistake to think that descriptive research can actually give you some insight into causality, but it doesn't. Descriptive research can ask, for example, consumers whether they would buy more of a product if its price were lowered. So as a result of that descriptive data, you could have conclusions such as, in our sample, 68% of consumers indicates they would buy more of a product if the price were lowered. But this only suggests causation. It doesn't prove causation. It shows a link, it shows a relationship, but it doesn't show that lowering the price actually causes people to buy more of that product. It's self-reported data. It can never give that insight into causality. If you truly want to find causal conclusions, you're going to have to do causal research that actually tests whether consumers buy more if a price is changed. So basically, if there is indeed an effect of X on Y. Just to make this idea more clear, let me present you with this example. If you want to understand whether students' drinking habits influence their GPA, then if you do a survey and you ask people, hey, what's your GPA? And then you ask, how much do you drink on average per week? How many consumptions, which alcohol, and so on. And then you correlate these two variables. You look at whether there's a relationship between these two variables. Then all you find is relational data. You didn't find an effect. If you truly want to know if drinking influences GPA, the only way around it is to do an experiment in which, let's say, I would, for example, split up the class in two groups. One group of you or one of my sections would drink heavily, and the other group I would make abstain from any alcohol, and then at the end of the semester see how that has influenced their GPA. This would come closer to investigating causal effects, but of course would be completely unethical. So this demonstrates that truly investigating causality is hard and has to be done with a proper experimental design. Now there's a couple conditions for inferring causality. First of all, there has to be temporal ordering of the independent and dependent variable. X should lead to Y and not the other way around. This makes total sense, but is sometimes forgotten when drawing causal conclusions. X, your independent variable, should precede the dependent variable in time, because something that happens after something else can no longer influence what happened before. Like, for example, with the drinking, if you ask people's GPA and then next month you let them drink, then the drinking that's going to happen next month can no longer retroactively influence their GPA of today. That makes no sense at all. So the cause has to happen before the effect. The second condition is there must be evidence of concomitant variation, and this is basically just a fancy word for there has to be a relationship between your two variables. X and Y, so your independent and your dependent variable, must be related, must have an association between them. This could be a positive relationship or a negative relationship. A positive relationship could be when X increases, Y increases as well, or in the absence of X, there's an absence of Y, or the opposite could be true. They could be inversely related, where an increase in X could lead to a decrease in Y. So either way, whether it's positive or negatively related, they must be related, because for one to have an effect on the other, there must be some relationship between them to begin with. If they're unrelated, then one cannot have an influence on the other. The third condition is there must be control over other causal factors, and these are called extraneous variables. In other words, we must make sure that it is indeed X that causes Y and not some random other variable, for example Z, that causes Y. And when this happens, when there's actually an other underlying variable that causes your outcome, and you mistakenly believe that it is your independent variable that is causing that outcome, in that case, you're dealing with a spurious association. Let me give you another very easy and very common example of a spurious association. Spurious association basically live on that premise of correlation does not imply causation. Data has shown that ice cream sales are highly positively correlated with drownings in pools. In other words, when more ice cream is sold, there's more drownings in pools. Now, does that mean that ice cream is causing people to drown in pools? Probably not. There must be some underlying factor, some underlying variable or lurking variable, you could also call this an extraneous variable or a confound, that explains this seemingly causal effect. In this case, and feel free to pause the video and think for yourself, but it's pretty self-evident that the problem here is heat waves. So a heat wave increases ice cream sales because when it's hot, people buy more ice cream. But a heat wave also increases drownings in pools because when it's hot, people swim more, and by consequence, there's more risk of drowning. So you can see that the arrow pointing from ice cream sales to drownings in pools has disappeared because the actual effect is caused by heat waves, which causes both the seemingly independent variable and dependent variable. If you want to read more about crazy spurious correlations and many more funny examples, feel free to take a look on the link below. Another great example here of correlation does not imply causation is data showing that the S&P 500, so the stock market, is correlated with Lil Yachty's LP releases. So every time Lil Yachty releases an LP, the stock market crashes. Super interesting phenomenon. Obviously, Lil Yachty cannot be blamed for stock market crashes. Sometimes we're dealing with a situation that is not a spurious correlation, but a mediation. And this is different, so please pay close attention to how the arrows are pointed in the example I'm going to give on this slide. So sometimes a driving factor or explanation is not a lurking variable, but is a mediator. For example, the rise in average global temperature, so global warming, causes more civil wars, climate refugees, and increased migration. How could that be the case? How could one topic, global warming, so significantly lead to another topic, civil war, climate refugees, and increased migration? What could explain this causal effect? The reality is that the underlying factor could be food shortages. So your independent variable, a rise in average global temperature, causes more food shortages because there's more agricultural disasters, which in turn, in and of itself, causes more civil war, climate refugees, and increased migration because people will leave the land that became inhabitable or no longer fit for agriculture, and therefore it may lead to a war over natural resources. So this is how climate change can actually indeed have such an impact on migration because of that mediation. And what you notice here is that the arrows are pointing in a different way than in the previous example where you had a spurious correlation. In this case, food shortages or agricultural disasters does not cause global warming. It only causes civil wars, climate refugees, and increased migration. It actually is in and of itself a mediating or intermediate variable, part of that chain of effects, if you will. All this talk about causality brings me to two very important concepts in experimental design, and that is internal validity and external validity. Internal validity pertains to what extent are the results truly only caused by the experimental manipulation or your independent variable and not by something else? In other words, how sure are we that X leads to Y and not something else is causing Y? External validity means that how replicable are the results we found in a natural setting? Would the results still hold if we were to replicate this experimental setup in a natural setting? So in other words, how robust is the effect? How realistic is the effect? I'll give you several examples of threats to internal validity and external validity. The first main threat to internal validity is history. History is any event that is external that can happen over time over the course of an experiment. Experiments are usually taking place over a certain period of time, and during that time, things can happen. So let's say, for example, you want to study whether Americans versus Europeans are happier growing up. So your independent variable would be place of birth, the United States versus Europe. That's the independent variable. The dependent variable would be happiness, just measuring happiness, self-reported happiness, for example, on a scale in a survey. Now, there could be various things happening over time, such as maybe in the case of the American growing up, 9/11 happened within their lifetime, or severe economic downturn during the course of their life on either continent. Or maybe one of them, their parents got divorced over the course of the experiment, and that impacted their happiness growing up as a teenager. various other things could have happened that are external and that influence happiness in this case, that are not place of birth or place of origin, the United States versus Europe. So all of these are confounds. Another example of a threat to internal validity is maturation. And maturation is the physiological, so physical, or psychological, so mental, changes that can happen in participants over time. So any physiological or mental change that is naturally a consequence of time can influence the results of the experiment. So examples of maturation are changes in mood, becoming tired, becoming bored, getting hungry, growing older, and so on. So any change that naturally happens over time within a person. One particular example is, let's say, if you want to test the effect of Kellogg's breakfast on children's reading abilities, let's say you set up an experiment over the course of a year, and in that year you have a control group and an experimental group. The experimental group gets Kellogg's for breakfast every day of that year. The control group of children does not get Kellogg's for breakfast, so they get maybe something else, an apple, fruit, oatmeal, whatever, over the course of that year. At the end of the experiment, at the end of the year, you compare their reading abilities, and you want to see if they're different for children who were part of the experimental group with Kellogg's for breakfast versus the control group who were not eating Kellogg's for breakfast. Now, certain things have changed in these children over time as a natural consequence of time. They've gotten better at reading simply because they've grown older. They got older, and they usually, as an effect of getting older, as a natural consequence of time passing, they got better at reading. So any changes in reading abilities could be caused simply by maturation rather than by what they had for breakfasts. Maturation can, of course, also be physical. So, for example, athletes who get injuries as a consequence of time and overtraining, that can influence their test results rather than, let's say, any food supplement, vitamin, water, etc. that you want to test as part of the experiment. Another threat to validity is instrument variation, and this is when the questionnaire changes before and after the treatment. Again, let's take the example of children eating Kellogg's for breakfast and measuring their reading abilities. Let's say as part of the experiment, you first subject children to a reading test. You just measure how good they are at reading. Then you give them Kellogg's for breakfast for a month straight, and then you measure their reading abilities again. Now, if the reading test is different moment one, so before the Kellogg's for breakfast, versus after, so after the Kellogg's for breakfast, if there's any differences in difficulty level between these reading tests, then obviously you're going to have differences in results. And especially if the post-test is easier than the pre-test, it's gonna seem like your Kellogg's for breakfast had a positive impact on reading abilities, whereas actually the test just got easier. Another threat to validity is selection bias. And selection bias means that you select individuals, in this case children, as part of the experiment in the experimental group and the control group, but based on different characteristics. So for example, if there's an uneven distribution of age and intelligence in the experimental group and the control group, you will end up with different results in reading abilities regardless of what breakfast they had. If you intentionally want to bias your results, which obviously you shouldn't, but if you would want to, you could put all the smart kids in the experimental group and all the older kids in the experimental group and all the children that are naturally better at reading in the experimental group and so on. And this way you will artificially boost the effect that Kellogg seems to have on reading abilities because you've inserted selection bias. Another threat to validity is mortality, and mortality means participants can drop out over the course of the experiment. If people get sick, they die, they move, they stop participating because they no longer want to participate, this all falls under the umbrella of mortality. Another threat is the testing effect, and the testing effect can easily be summarized as practice makes perfect. If you have pre-tests and post-tests, the pre-tests in themselves can influence the performance on post-tests simply because respondents have already done it before. So let's say, for example, if I let you take an SAT test and then I give you Adderall and then I let you take another SAT test just to see what the effect is of Adderall on your SAT test performance, then the mere fact that you've already done an SAT test prior can boost your results, can actually make you better at performing on the SAT test the second time around, simply because you've done it before. Yes, for sure, maybe the Adderall gives a boost, or maybe it doesn't, but regardless, you have a confound because the pretest can create this testing effect. Next threat to validity, and yes, there's many, is regression to the mean. Regression to the mean is a phenomenon that is hard to explain in experimental design, but tends to show that with regard to pre-tests and post-tests, people tend to regress to the average. So people who answered more extremely, either extremely positive or extremely negative on a certain scale in the pre-test, the second time around when you ask them again, they tend to regress towards the average answer. So the more outspokenly positive or higher on the scale answers tend to go down a little bit, whereas the more outspoken negative answers tend to go up a little bit. And this phenomenon is, again, still hard to explain, but if you think that a certain stimulus, a certain treatment, certain experimental setup may have caused the change, it could actually be due to the regression to the mean phenomenon. Another threat to validity is the pretest manipulation interaction bias. This may sound like the testing effect, but it's not the same. So remember, with the testing effect, the idea was practice makes perfect. So a pretest can influence your performance on a post-test because you've done it before. That's the testing effect. Now, the pretest manipulation interaction bias means that there's an interesting interaction happening between your pretest and your manipulation, so the stimulus you expose people to. For example, if you first ask people a ton of questions about how involved they are with activism, how much they care about the BLM, Black Lives Matter movement, and so on, you ask them a ton of questions about their background in that regard, then you show them an ad, let's say, for example, the ad by Nike, and then you ask them in a post-test how they perceive the ad, how they think about the ad, what their attitudes toward the ad are, and so on. Now, the problem is here that simply due to the fact that you asked all these questions beforehand about their activism history, and then you expose them to that ad, this could create a very interesting mix here, because those questions could make them more sensitive to the ad, could heighten their alertness to the topic, could actually increase or decrease their receptiveness to the ad, which in and of itself, in a combined way, could influence their outcome. Sounds convoluted, but yes, this can happen, and this is called priming. So if you prime people by putting them in a certain mindset first, by asking them tons of questions about a topic, which literally makes that topic top of mind for them, it's going to influence how they regard any subsequent stimulus, which in a combined way together is going to influence the outcome variable. This is called the pretest manipulation interaction bias. Another issue could be non-representative sample bias, and this is easy to understand. If your sample is only white men and your projected population is everyone, then obviously you have a non-representative sample. And this will compromise the external validity, because whatever effect you find in white men is not going to be generalizable to the general population. A couple more threats to validity are reactivity bias and the placebo effect. Reactivity bias can be summarized as a situation where individuals change their behavior simply because they are aware of the fact that they are being observed, or simply because they are aware of the expectations of the experiment. The Hawthorne effect is famously described in the so-called illumination studies. So in the 30s, there was a researcher called Hawthorne who wanted to look at whether changing the intensity of lights, so basically changing out the light bulbs for more bright ones, would influence factory workers' productivity. So what he did was, with his research team, went to factories and changed out the light bulbs to see how it influenced people's productivity in the factories. Turns out people became a lot more productive, and this effect in itself could not only be attributed to the change in light, but simply due to the fact that the people in the factory, the workers, were aware of the fact that they were being observed and that they were part of an experiment. And this was famously described as the Hawthorne effect. So this is the awareness of people that they are in the experimental condition. Now, the John Henry effect is similar, but this is caused by the awareness of being in the control condition rather than in the experimental condition. So when people know that they are part of the control condition, for example, the condition that does not get the swapped out light bulbs, so does not get the lighter or brighter light bulbs, when they change their behavior simply because they know they are part of the control group and they think nothing is expected of them because they know they're in the control group, this in and of itself could influence their performance or their behavior. The experimentary effect occurs when researchers communicate the expectations of the experiment in a subtle way at the beginning of the experiment. So when respondents or participants in an experiment can sense what the experimenter wants to get out of it, they can start behaving in a way to meet those expectations. When researchers communicate their expectations, this could cause people to act accordingly. The Pygmalion effect is similar to the experimentary effect, but specifically in a student-teacher context. I'm sure you've all heard of these examples where if you tell a child over and over again that he or she is doing great, they're really good readers, they're amazing in math, they're doing great, they will actually start doing better as a result of that. It will lift them up. Whereas the opposite is true as well. If you keep telling a child it's not doing great and it is dumb and it doesn't know anything and it will never amount to anything, this will become a self-fulfilling prophecy too. Children will actually start to internalize that feedback and start acting accordingly, and this is called the Pygmalion effect. The placebo effect is very famous as well. This is one effect caused by participants' own expectations rather than any expectations caused by the researcher or the experiment, and also not caused by the actual experimental treatment. So if people think they will experience an effect of something, even if it's a placebo pill, a sugar pill, or anything, and as a result they feel better or they feel worse, this in itself is an effect that is called the placebo effect. Now, we just talked about tons of threats to internal and external validity, but luckily there are ways to control these threats to validity, at least to some extent. One of the things you can do is randomization. Randomization means you randomly assign subjects or experimental participants to either the experimental condition or the control condition. Physical control or matching is an alternative for random assignment, because in this case you don't leave it up to chance, so you don't use randomization, but you actually interfere as a researcher to ensure that certain key characteristics between your respondents are evenly matched in your experimental group and your control group. So any characteristics that could be relevant or could be confounds in the experiment, such as age, gender, income, and so on, depending on your experimental topic, any of these could be relevant. So you want to make sure that there's an even distribution, literally 1 per 1, in the experimental condition versus the control condition. Design control means that you set up your experimental design in such a way that it is more robust, and as a consequence of that robustness, you have more guarantee that any effect you find in your dependent variable is indeed truly caused by your independent variable and not by something else. So we will go over design control later in one of the next sessions. Lastly, there is statistical control, which means that through statistical analysis, you can keep certain factors or certain levels of variables constant across conditions, or eliminate the effect they have or control the effect they have on your experimental dependent variable. Now, of course, in order to statistically control these variables, you need to have measured them in the first place. So if they're not part of your questionnaire, you can never have that data, so you can never control for it. The way to control for that is through an ANCOVA, so analysis of covariance, by inserting these variables as covariates in your analyses. A good example and a way to test yourself would be this case here, where I present you with a scenario and I could ask what can threaten the validity in this design. So let's say, for example, a researcher wants to do a study on what the effect of an anti-smoking campaign has on smoking opinions. The experimental group is exposed to an anti-smoking message and the control group is not exposed to an anti-smoking message. Then the researcher asks that all respondents, so both the ones in the control condition as well as in the experimental condition, report their opinion about smoking in a questionnaire. So what could threaten the validity in this design? Thinking of all the threats to internal and external validity we discussed in the previous minutes, what could play a role here in this design? The answers can be found in the note pages of these slides. You could visualize the experiment as follows. You have two conditions. the experimental condition and the control condition. The experimental condition is exposed to a PSA, an anti-smoking campaign, and subsequently asked, what is your opinion about smoking? The control condition is not exposed to this anti-smoking ad, but is also asked, what is your opinion about smoking? So again, you can list all potential threats to internal validity that could have an influence on people's opinion about smoking. Interestingly, the testing effect or the pretest manipulation interaction bias cannot have an effect here because there is no pretest. The only time people's opinion about smoking is being asked is after the experimental stimulus. There is no pre-measure, so in that case there cannot be any pretest manipulation interaction bias or any testing effect.